Welcome to the David Pakman Show. Yesterday I talked about the George Zimmerman verdict and how we really need to see it as only an evaluation of the facts or lack of facts, lack of evidence in that particular case, and not any more broadly, not make inferences necessarily about what it means regarding gun rights, what it means regarding conservative values, or the jurors in particular. However, we now have actual evidence. One of the jurors, Juror B37, has done an interview with Anderson Cooper, and it was a very disturbing interview. I talked about when I was on a self-defense case on a jury, 4 of the 6 jurors did not understand the evidence, did not understand the definition of the laws as we were supposed to evaluate guilt or innocence. And I thought, listen, they've gone through countless interviews in the Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman jury selection. I'm sure they picked people that are going to understand that law, understand the evidence, and I was absolutely wrong. Juror B37 said a whole bunch of just outrageous things that show not only bias, but also a lack of understanding of the evidence and a number of assumptions not based on fact that this particular juror chose to believe. And if this is representative of the jury more broadly, I would be very, very concerned about this verdict, even if from an outside point of view, based on the evidence presented, I could understand why a not guilty verdict happened. This is a juror who, during her voir dire pre-trial interview, said that she has a license to carry a concealed gun. Sometimes she goes to the shooting range. She also referred to Trayvon Martin as a boy of color. Let's get right into the clips. Here's clip 1. Asked who was on top in the struggle between George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin that was more or less accepted as fact in the case. Let's take a look at clip number 1.
The prosecution started off by saying that George Zimmerman was on top in the struggle. And then later on, they seemed to concede, well, perhaps Trayvon Martin was on top, but maybe was pulling away. Do you feel that the prosecution really had a firm idea of what actually happened?
I think they wanted to happen what they wanted to happen, to go to their side, for the prosecution, the state. There was a lot, the witnesses that the defense had on, plus some of the prosecution witnesses, there was no doubt that they had seen what had happened. Some of it was taped, so they couldn't rebut any of that.
So kind of an unintelligible answer there. This was the number 1 red flag as I watched this interview, that this juror may not really be understanding what even happened during this testimony. Let's look at clip number 2 now, asking about who do you think it was calling for help on that 911 tape, a key point of the case.
You had the parents of Trayvon Martin testifying. You had the family of George Zimmerman, friends of George Zimmerman testifying about whose voice it was in the 911 call. Whose voice do you think it was in the 911 call?
I think it was George Zimmerman's.
Did everybody in the jury agree with that?
All but probably one.
And what made you think it was George Zimmerman's voice?
Because of the evidence that he was the one that had gotten beaten.
So you think because he was the one who had cuts, had abrasions, he was the one getting hit, he was the one calling for help?
Well, because the witnesses of John Good saw Trayvon on top of George, not necessarily hitting him because it was so dark he couldn't see, but he saw blows down towards George. And he could tell that it was George Zimmerman on the bottom. He didn't know who it was, but he knew what they were wearing.
So there it is. The idea that it was George Zimmerman's voice and that she really thought John Good's testimony was really good. John Good's testimony was completely called into question by the prosecution, and she really chose to believe that George Zimmerman was on top. She even said, well, John Good saw or rather that George Zimmerman was not on top, was on the bottom. She said, well, John Good saw that it was Trayvon on top. Well, he actually didn't see it, but he saw the movement and he knew what they were wearing. Very concerning, Lewis, because while they're not supposed to make assumptions, a lot of assumptions not based on facts presented are being made here.
Well, that's human nature. And unfortunately, I would put money on it that every single juror already had ideas about what happened in their head the day that the trial started. And you don't have to be smart to get through jury selection. This is proof of that. And I stand by what I said earlier, that jurors should be selected at random, but at random from a pool of experts who know the laws, who understand them, and who possibly do this for a living.
Well, some countries do have professional juries, and there are a whole number of other issues with that, and we've gotten a lot of email about that the last time you suggested that. For now, though, let's continue with the clips. Here's clip 3. Let's take a look at this one.
What did you think of George Zimmerman?
I think George Zimmerman is a man whose heart was in the right place, but just got displaced by the vandalism in the neighborhoods and wanting to catch these people so badly that he went above and beyond what he really should have done.
This, to me, was where I realized that there is so much conjecture here. George Zimmerman's heart in the right place. That's a statement that shows that this juror buys into not only the facts as per the evidence, the facts as presented by the defense, but really bought into the George Zimmerman narrative altogether outside of what was presented in the court. This idea that he was just this really good-natured neighborhood watch guy. And she actually went on to say in the interview she would trust, she would be fine having George Zimmerman be on the neighborhood watch in her neighborhood. Very disturbing, Lewis. This is not an unbiased juror.
Not at all. She totally sympathizes with him. And who knows what she's saying at home about Trayvon Martin. I can only imagine.
Let's look at clip number 4.
Do you think Trayvon Martin threw the first punch?
I think he did.
What makes you think that?
Because of the evidence of on the tee or on the sidewalk where George says he was punched. There was evidence of his flashlight and keys there. And then a little bit farther down, there was a flashlight that he was carrying. And I think that's where Trayvon hit him.
So you think, based on the testimony you heard, you believe that Trayvon Martin was the aggressor?
I think the roles changed. I think George got in a little bit too deep, which he shouldn't have been there. But Trayvon decided that he wasn't going to let him scare him and get the one over up on him or something.
All right, so they're saying she believes Trayvon threw the first punch. Completely not presented in evidence in any way. Absolutely a story that the juror built for herself or with other jurors in their heads. Very, very concerning. And then clip 5, there was an animation which was not allowed during the main trial, right? The defense had an animation created of their interpretation of what happened. The judge said, no, this is not really evidence. In closing, however, the defense was allowed to present that animation. It was a completely biased and unprovable and not based on fact presentation of what happened. The juror was asked, what did you think of that presentation? Let's take a look at clip 5.
When the defense, in their closing argument, played that animation of what they believe happened, did you find that credible?
I found it credible. I did.
So there it is. She believed that that animation depicted what happened. Again, not based on any evidence that is provable, pure conjecture. This is a disaster, an absolute disaster. This to me really represents, I'm not angry with this juror. It really just represents the problems. For all of the good things about our justice system, we've got serious problems when this is the person, doesn't understand the evidence, is making stuff up in her mind and then creating a decision about the person's guilt or innocence based on that. Highly concerning, Lewis. I'm distraught by the content of this interview.
It's really unfortunate. You have to wonder, you have to assume that this is happening all the time, all across the country, and in certain states and certain situations, people are being put to death because of the decisions made by moron jurors like this.
To a certain extent, I do feel sorry for the woman because she doesn't seem to be very bright, but this is lives we're dealing with, and it is very, very concerning.